Konrad Curze was a man who, if nothing else, carried himself with conviction. On his worst days, he was a completely unhinged sadist who wanted to see the galaxy brought to ruin, but if you asked him, that's when he was at his best. Konrad went through several evolutions in his lifetime, but there was always one prevailing sentiment. Rain or snow, sleet or shine, he intended to be a living, breathing pair of creased black Air Force Ones. Normally I would just say dusty black forces, but that sounded pretty bad out of context when I was writing it down. You see, that's the thing. Where a normal person would consider maybe not saying that, Konrad would say it just to make you uncomfortable. Then, when he felt like he'd properly unnerved you, he'd turn you into a flesh piñata, because nothing matters and we're all gonna die anyway. Today we will go through his progression from an idealist, to a nihilist, to a fatalist. When the scattering would occur and all the baby Primarchs got strewn about the galaxy, Konrad got the second worst outcome. This would be second only to baby Angron being sold into a gladiatorial slave arena, but there is room for debate here, as you'll see. Konrad splashed down on Nostromo, which is pretty much Planet Gotham but worse. A fun fact about Connie, he's got the very same ability to peer into the future as Sanguinius, but it's much more potent. It's also flawed in only being able to show him the most horrible outcome possible in his choices. This means, since his first moments of consciousness, he was able to see the ferocious animal that he was going to become. Which brings us to an exercise you should repeat several times today, asking yourself, what would you do in his shoes? This is the most crucial part in forming how you feel about Konrad. If you were born into a world of darkness with unavoidable visions of becoming one of the monsters that lived in it, would you fight your fate? Konrad attempted to in his youth, but those cut from Nostromo's cloth have a twisted understanding of benevolent intentions. A formal system of incarceration or rehabilitation in Nostromo is genuinely impossible, so that was never on the table. Konrad chose the next best option, grabbing the population by their throats to force them in line, and all who failed to behave would lose their lives. I'm personally not the kind of guy to fault someone for merited brutality, especially in this circumstance, so I stand on the necessary evil side of the aisle here. Konrad did the best with what he was provided, instated himself as the leader of their society, and actually ended up improving the quality of life there. However, this was still never able to make the nightmares of his future cease. Turns out I forgot to record this portion, and I'm only finding out now in post, so I might sound a little different, but anyway, back to it. Now and henceforth, Konrad goes on a straight downward trend, or upward depending on how you see it. As the story always goes, the Emperor comes to town, but this time it goes unprecedentedly horrible. Angron was the only one who got a worse shake. Konrad would meet Rogel Dorn, and his foresight showed Dorn being Julius Caesared to death in a dark hallway. Then Lorgar screaming in agony as his planet was incinerated, and next was Ferris, decapitated, with his brother holding his head, and after him Fulgrim in his future demonic form. Finally, the Emperor. Konrad attempted to gouge his own eyes out once he looked into his father's future. He was able to see all the consequence of the wars to come, and a vision of his own death to pair them with. This is going to be a bit unusual, but we're ignoring his Night Lord's Legion because we need to focus on Konrad's highlight reel. The quick look is that they commit atrocities to scare a population into giving up. Another Angron comparison here, they have their phenomenal star players, but are otherwise non-factors. It's like having a godly quarterback-tight end combination with a terrible offensive line. Eventually we'll turn focus to Sevatar and Talos, who are the other hard carries of this legion, but that's a different day. All you need to know is Konrad and his close crew carried all the true weight of the Night Lord's reputation. Due to his grotesque methods of war, Konrad quickly became an iconoclast amongst his brothers, soon being thrown out of the Emperor's good graces as well. Eventually Nostromo fell back into disarray, much to Konrad's dismay, and he was left in a sea of emotions and horrible premonitions. In this moment of weakness, he would tell his brother Fulgrim, who would then tell the always super, very totally understanding Rogel Dorn. This went as terribly as it sounds, and ended with Rogel confronting Konrad, which then ended in Rogel getting knocked the fuck out. Konrad felt terrible about this and allowed himself to be imprisoned, but then he decided he still had some punishing that needed to be done. Curze then beat Horus to the finish line in the race of betraying the Emperor, and so far he's been semi-reasonable in his cause to betray his space Jesus dad. Every ounce of good he did, he saw brought to ruin in the future, and once his homeworld reverted back to a shit show, he was done trying to be a hero. Konrad returned to Nostromo and fired his ship's orbital lasers into the planet's core, cleansing his home of evil once and for all by destroying it completely. The Imperium thought it was more important to preserve unity instead of turning Konrad into an enemy here, so they'd let him play in his own little corner of the universe for a while. His return was brought upon by a completely moronic fault in command structure. You'll notice there's a whole lot of that in Warhammer. They wanted someone clearly pissed at the Emperor to go fight Horus. So, obviously, this results in him joining Horus's forces in the galactic civil war that was soon to come. Konrad hoped that at least his visions of being murdered by an agent of the Emperor could finally dissipate with the shockwaves this caused, but nothing. Still plagued with his unchanging visions of the very same death that would befall him, he decided he's got no business in giving a fuck about this reality anymore. From here, it's just Konrad becoming a highlight reel of fraternal torment without ever having need to consort with the Chaos Gods. There will now be a running tally of Konrad's fight record against Primarchs. We already covered Rogel's stabbing, so Corvus is next for interaction, but there wasn't a fight. Some say Corvus was scared, but the ones with reading comprehension know that Corvus saw Konrad as what he might turn into if he fell from grace, so he just left. The next Primarch who fell victim to Konrad's insanity was Vulcan. Finding an unconscious Vulcan on the battlefields of Isfahan V, he had him transported and imprisoned on his ship. If you aren't aware, Vulcan is a big ol' perpetual, so he's not going to die no matter how much you kill him. Konrad enjoyed killing him repeatedly until he realized Vulcan won't actually truly die. So he then had Perturabo of the Iron Legion build a labyrinth to kill Vulcan forever, with Vulcan's hammer in the center as a reward. Of course, Konrad gets mad his murder maze isn't killing enough, opens the gates right to the hammer, and then faces off with Vulcan. Vulcan smashes his face with the hammer several times, then uses its built-in teleporter to escape Konrad's ship. So this one's going into a loss, because until then, Vulcan was in chains or unarmed. So far it's a win, loss, and a no contest, so it's not looking great, but it does get better. Next fight is a pretty big name. We've got Konrad versus the Lion. Their meeting went well enough initially, then everything fell to insults and violence, as I'm sure we expected between these two. Konrad gets the win on this one because he was choking the life out of the Lion until he got stabbed. Honestly, the only reason the Lion is alive right now is because the sword of one of his sons was put directly in the base of Konrad's spine. Both Legion dragged away their dads to fight another day, but Konrad is up 1-0 on the Lion. There was also the time where Konrad hid on the Lion's ship for several weeks, but no ground was made, so it's really a no contest. So he's 2-1 with 2 scratches now. Eventually he found himself on Rabute's home planet, fighting both him and the Lion at the same time. People talk about this being his most impressive fight, but it's not. His best fight is the first one with the Lion because he had him dead without interference. The fight against Gilly and the Lion consists of Gilly sucking at fighting and the Lion having to clean up after him. It's very much Obi-Wan and Anakin versus Dooku Part 1. Somehow, Gilly's absence in a duel is more helpful than his presence, but that's not surprising. Eventually, Konrad detonates a bomb and buries both brothers in rubble, and they need to be teleported to safety. Dirty tactic, yes, but it's Konrad, so he's got 4 wins, 1 loss, and 2 no contests now. He then fought Vulcan again, and this is honestly hard to judge because Vulcan dies, but also doesn't really die. So he fights without caring if you cut his head off because he's just gonna keep punching. Eventually, as it dragged out, a guy named John stabbed Vulcan with a magical crystal and killed him for a little while. Although he did not deliver the final blow himself, it could not have been possible without his direct interference, so he gets the nod here. He did fight Sanguinius to a semi-stalemate, and then went on to fight the Lion one final time. However, people always say, well, Konrad was able to fight Sanguinius to a stalemate. Sanguinius didn't even have power armor on, and Konrad did. So, realistically, that one's a ridiculous comparison. Anyway, back to the Lion. The Lion would win, breaking his back and imprisoning him, leaving Konrad Curze with a Primarch fighting record of 5 wins, 2 losses, and 2 no contests, certifying him as our predominant menace against all Primarchs. Konrad would have no more fights with his brothers because Sanguinius jammed him in a tube and shot him into space after that. With no destination, he drifted in the void, missing the ending of the Civil War, and eventually got scooped up by a salvage ship. Curze killed nearly everyone on the ship in true Curze fashion and spared a little guy named Elver. He then used Elver as a torture doll and therapist for several years before meeting back with his legion and killing him. Never forget Elver's contribution to the story. Having gone completely insane at this point, even his most trusted sons were disappointed in what he'd become. Which brings us to the end of Konrad's story, allowing an assassin sent by the Emperor to kill him. His last words? Death is nothing compared to vindication. His way of showing that none of his evil deeds mattered in the grand scheme of things, because his ending would never change. This was the story of the biggest menace to society that the Emperor had ever produced. An idealist plagued by premonitions of becoming a monster every waking moment of his life. A man born into depravity, never being able to fully loose its grip upon him. Maybe he was right in accepting his fate. Maybe it was pointless trying to fight it. Or maybe it wasn't. In any case, I'll leave you with the same question I had asked in the beginning. What would you have done in his shoes? If you enjoyed this, feel free to take a look at the other Primarch videos. The playlist should show up in one of the corners. If you'd like to vote on the final 4 in future polls, hop into the Discord server in the channel info. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and have a good night.